Millionaire disguises himself to inspect his restaurant, but when he heard a conversation between employees, he was in tears. Richard "Rick" Lawson had built an empire in the restaurant industry. From humble beginnings, he had transformed a single small eatery into a nationwide chain of high-end dining establishments. Though his restaurants were praised for their gourmet dishes and impeccable service, Rick himself had grown distant from the everyday operations. His life was a whirlwind of meetings, acquisitions, and luxury, far removed from the kitchens and dining rooms that had once fueled his passion. But then, troubling rumors reached him. One of his flagship restaurants in New York City, a place that had once been a shining example of excellence, was now struggling. Complaints about poor service, declining food quality, and unhappy employees were beginning to surface. Reviews online painted a picture of a restaurant that had lost its soul. Rick's instincts told him something was seriously wrong. At first, he considered handling the issue the way he always had, through reports, meetings, and sending in a regional manager. But deep down, he knew that wouldn't give him the full picture. Numbers and reports didn't tell the story of the people working in that restaurant, the real heartbeat of his business. If he wanted to understand the truth, he had to see it for himself. So, he made a decision. Rick ditched his tailored suits for simple jeans and a faded hoodie. He wore old sneakers, a baseball cap pulled low over his face, and removed anything that hinted at his wealth. If he wanted to experience the reality of his restaurant, he had to blend in. No one would respect a temporary kitchen worker with calluses on their hands and sweat on their brow. No one would recognize him as the multi-millionaire behind the company. And that was exactly what he wanted. With his disguise in place, Rick arrived at the restaurant just before the evening rush. It was a beautiful place on the outside. Tall glass windows, a stylish black and gold sign, and a warm, inviting glow spilling onto the sidewalk. But as soon as he stepped inside, he felt a difference. There was tension in the air, a kind of hurried exhaustion that clashed with the restaurant's elegant setting. The smell of spices and sizzling meats filled the space, but so did the sharp voice of someone barking orders. Rick walked up to the back entrance where new hires were expected to report. He was greeted by a tired-looking assistant manager who barely glanced at him before thrusting a uniform into his hands. "You're the new guy?" the man asked, not waiting for an answer. "Great. Put that on and get to the kitchen. Dishes are already piling up." Rick simply nodded. He didn't expect a warm welcome, but he also didn't expect to be thrown into the chaos so quickly. He slipped into the uniform, a plain black shirt and apron, and stepped into the kitchen. The moment he entered, he was hit by a wave of noise. The clatter of pots, the sizzle of food on the grill, the hurried voices of cooks calling out orders. It was a familiar symphony, one he hadn't heard up close in years. He took his place at the sink, rolling up his sleeves and plunging, his hands into the soapy water. As he scrubbed the first batch of plates, he kept his ears open, listening to the flow of the kitchen. Some voices were sharp and impatient, while others carried the weight of exhaustion. But there was also something else, an undercurrent of camaraderie, of people trying to support each other despite the pressure. Rick stole a glance at the staff around him. Some looked weary, their movements mechanical from repetition. Others moved with the kind of precision that came from years of experience. He spotted a young man, no older than 20, scrubbing at a stubborn pan with determined effort. Nearby, a waitress with kind eyes and a patient demeanor balanced multiple plates while offering encouraging words to her colleagues. And then there was a man standing near the kitchen entrance, arms crossed, eyes scanning the room with a permanent look of disapproval. Rick didn't know him yet, but he could tell immediately this was someone who held power in this place. And if the rumors were true, he was at the center of the restaurant's problems. Rick continued washing dishes, blending into the background. He wasn't just there to observe, he needed to feel what it was like to work in his own business. Again. And if there were issues, he was going to uncover them firsthand, but he had no idea just how much this experience would change him. Let me know if you're happy with this part before I continue with the next one. Rick plunged his hands into the soapy water, scrubbing plates as fast as he could to keep up with the steady flow of dirty dishes. The kitchen was a flurry of activity. chefs, shouted orders. Burners flared, knives chopped with rhythmic precision. It was a chaotic but strangely coordinated dance, a mix of urgency and discipline. Yet beneath the surface, Rick could sense the tension, the weight pressing down on the staff. He stole glances at his co-workers as he worked. There was the young dishwasher beside him, a wiry kid with tired eyes who moved with surprising efficiency. Further ahead, cooks moved with mechanical precision, their faces set in deep concentration. A woman in her 40s, possibly the lead cook, moved from station to station, correcting errors and adjusting seasoning with quick, expert movements. She had the air of someone who knew her job inside and out. Then there was the waitress he had noticed earlier, the one with kind eyes. She was weaving through the crowded kitchen, balancing a heavy tray with practiced ease while calling out a greeting to the overwhelmed-looking hostess near the front. Something about her energy stood out. Unlike the others who moved with the weight of exhaustion, she carried herself with resilience. Rick had expected to find a completely broken system, workers who had given up, an atmosphere of defeat. Instead, what he saw was a team still pushing forward despite the odds. They weren't thriving, but they hadn't quit either. There was still a pulse in this place, a stubborn refusal to let things crumble. Yet the problems were undeniable. The manager he had noticed earlier, Tom, had a presence that was impossible to ignore. He wasn't actively working. He was watching, scrutinizing, waiting for someone to make a mistake. His posture was rigid, his gaze sharp and unyielding. Every few minutes he would step forward to snap at an employee, his tone clipped and impatient. When a young line cook accidentally plated a dish incorrectly, Tom snatched up the plate and dumped it in the trash with an exaggerated sigh. "Do it again," he ordered, his voice low and simmering with irritation. "And this time, don't waste my time." Rick saw the cook's shoulders tense. He didn't argue, didn't defend himself. He simply nodded, eyes fixed on the counter as he started the dish over. The reaction wasn't anger or frustration, it was fear. Rick clenched his jaw and forced himself to keep scrubbing. He couldn't react. Not yet. He needed to learn more. The night pressed on, the rush hitting its peak. Plates piled up. Orders came in faster than they could be filled, and the air grew hotter with the combined heat of the stoves and bodies moving in close quarters. Rick felt sweat drip down his back as he worked, his hands raw from the constant exposure to water and soap. It had been years since he had done physical labor like this, and his body reminded him of that with every aching muscle. Despite the pressure, he started noticing something else, something that surprised him. Even in the chaos, the workers helped each other. The young dishwasher beside him, Jake, elbowed him lightly when he noticed Rick struggling with a particularly stubborn pan. "Hot water helps," he muttered, tilting the sprayer to douse the dish with scalding water before handing it back. Rick nodded his thanks, watching as Jake worked with practiced efficiency, his hands moving fast but careful. On the other side of the kitchen, the waitress, Emily as he overheard someone call her, helped a new hire carry an overloaded tray, whispering encouragement. The head cook subtly adjusted the seasoning in a sauce when she noticed a line cook, faltering but didn't call him out on it, allowing him to save face. They had built a support system for each other. It wasn't enough to erase the pressure, but it was something. Rick had expected the restaurant to be failing because of lazy workers or careless mistakes. But now he saw the truth. The workers weren't the problem. They were trying, they cared, they were exhausted, yes, but they hadn't given up. The problem was above them, and at the center of it was Tom. The manager prowled the floor, his presence alone making the workers stiffen. Every time he spoke, it was either to criticize or to issue orders. He never praised, never acknowledged hard work. To him, the workers were tools, interchangeable, replaceable, and undeserving of respect. Rick's hands tightened into fists. Under the water. He had spent years building this company. He had believed in quality, not just in food, but in people. How had it come to this? He took a deep breath and forced himself to keep going. He wasn't done gathering information. As the shift neared its end, the workers moved a little slower, fatigue settling in. The rush had passed, but the work wasn't over. Tables needed clearing, dishes needed drying, and the kitchen needed to be scrubbed. Rick was about to grab another tray of dishes when he heard something that made him pause. Emily had stepped outside for a break, her voice drifting through the back door where she spoke with Jake. "One more night down," she said, her tone light, but laced with exhaustion. "How are you holding up?" Jake sighed. "Tired, but that's nothing new." "You did good tonight." A beat of silence, then a quiet chuckle from Jake. "Thanks. Not sure how much longer I can keep this up, though." Rick turned slightly, keeping his movements slow so they wouldn't notice him. "You're not thinking of quitting, are you?" Emily asked. "Not quitting," Jake said, but there was hesitation in his voice. I don't know. Feels like no matter how hard I work, nothing changes. I want to do more, you know? Maybe go to culinary school, but that's just a dream, right?" Emily was quiet for a moment. Then she spoke, her voice softer now. "It's not just a dream. If you want it, you'll find a way. You're talented, Jake. One day, you'll get there." Rick felt something shift inside him. He had come here expecting to find a failing restaurant, a mess that needed fixing. But what he found was different. He found people who still had hope, people who wanted more. And yet here they were, stuck in a system that crushed that hope day after day. He had seen enough. This wasn't just about a struggling restaurant anymore. It was about the people who made it run, the people who deserved better. And Rick was going to do something about it. Rick continued working through the night, pushing through the ache in his muscles and the heat of the kitchen. The restaurant had begun to slow down as the rush ended, but the exhaustion clung to the staff like a heavy fog. As he rinsed off the last of the plates from a particularly messy order, he caught sight of the head manager, Tom, speaking in hushed but firm tones to one of the cooks. Something about the man's stance made Rick pause, observing without making it obvious. Tom stood with his arms crossed, towering over the young cook, who looked no older than 20. The cook's eyes were fixed downward, his posture stiff with barely concealed anxiety. "You messed up table 12's order," Tom said, his voice sharp. "That steak went out overcooked, and do you know what happened?" The cook swallowed hard. "They sent it back?" "They sent it back," Tom confirmed, his tone clipped. "And you wasted a $50 cut of meat in the process. Do you think we can afford that?" I can do better next time," the cook stammered. "There shouldn't be a next time," Tom snapped. "You screw up again, and I start cutting your hours." Rick felt his fingers tighten around the dish he was holding. Cutting hours over one mistake? That was more than just strict management. It was intimidation. And the worst part? The kid looked like he actually believed he deserved that kind of treatment. Tom turned away without another word, leaving the cook standing there, shoulders slumped. Rick had seen enough. He dried his hands, glancing at the clock. Still another hour before closing. He had to remain patient, keep gathering information before he made his move. As he made his way toward the storage area to grab more cleaning supplies, he caught another moment that made his stomach twist. A waitress had just finished serving a table when she accidentally knocked over a glass while clearing plates. It shattered on the floor with a sharp crash. She flinched, immediately crouching to clean it up. Before she could, Tom was already there. "Are you serious?" he barked. "It was an accident," the waitress said quickly, clearly nervous. "I'll clean it up." Tom exhaled loudly, shaking his head. "You're getting sloppy. First, you forget to put in an order correctly earlier, and now this. If I have to start looking for someone more competent, let me know now." Rick's hands clenched at his sides. He had led teams for years, built an empire based on food and service. He knew how pressure worked in this industry, how one mistake could snowball into a bigger problem. But this was something else entirely. This was fear-based management, a system where employees weren't allowed to be human. He watched as the waitress cleaned the shards, her hands trembling slightly. Tom had no idea he was being watched by the very man who could end his career with a single decision. Rick had intended to wait longer before stepping in, but his patience was wearing thin. The employees here weren't just overworked, they were being actively mistreated. He needed to learn more before making his move, but it was clear. Tom had to go. As the night progressed, Rick noticed how the rest of the team functioned around their manager. They worked efficiently, but not because of his leadership, rather, despite it. They whispered quick words of encouragement to each other. Covered. for mistakes before Tom could notice, and looked out for the younger employees who seemed the most nervous under his gaze. Emily, the waitress Rick had noticed earlier, was particularly good at this. She moved with grace, always ready to step in when someone needed help. When a busboy tripped while carrying a heavy tray, she caught the edge of it before it toppled completely, saving most of the plates. Instead of snapping at him, she just smiled and said, "Don't worry about it, it happens." Rick had no doubt she had been working here for years. She carried herself like someone who knew the job inside and out, someone who had seen the best and worst of the industry. And yet she still cared. That more than anything told Rick that the restaurant had potential, it just needed the right leadership. As closing time approached, Tom made another announcement. "Payroll cuts are coming," he said, addressing the staff. "Corporate's been on my ass about expenses. I'm already looking at trimming extra shifts, so if you don't want to lose hours, I suggest you step up." A few employees exchanged uneasy glances. No one spoke. Rick watched, anger burning low in his chest. He knew how corporate expenses worked. He had set the budgets himself. This wasn't about payroll cuts. This was Tom using fear to squeeze every last drop of effort from his employees. It was time to start putting his plan into motion. Rick made a mental note of every mistreatment, every misstep Tom made. He didn't just want to fire the man, he wanted to make sure the restaurant never operated this way again. Before the night ended, he overheard another conversation that cemented his resolve. Jake, the young dishwasher, was talking quietly to Emily in the back, his voice filled with frustration. "I don't get it," he muttered. "Why do we even bother? No one at the top cares about people like us. We're just numbers to them." Emily sighed. "I used to think that too. But I still believe there are good people in charge somewhere, people who actually see us." Rick felt his throat tighten. He had started this journey thinking he was coming in to fix a business problem, but it wasn't just about business anymore. He had forgotten what it was like to be on the ground, to see the struggle firsthand. That was about to change. Rick had seen enough to confirm that something was deeply wrong in his restaurant. The place wasn't failing because of lazy employees or declining food quality. It was suffering under poor management. Tom's leadership, if it could even be called that, was built on intimidation. Workers performed their tasks not out of pride, but out of fear. They didn't feel valued. They felt disposable. Yet despite everything, there was still something remarkable about the staff. They weren't just co-workers, they were allies, supporting each other in a way that management never would. If there was one thing keeping this restaurant afloat, it was the resilience of the team. Rick had spent the entire night washing dishes, blending into the background as much as possible. He had studied every interaction, every tension-filled moment between Tom and the staff. But there was still more he needed to learn, more that couldn't be observed in the frantic energy of a dinner rush. So, when the restaurant began to wind down and the last few customers lingered over their meals, he took the opportunity to step outside for a break. He wasn't the only one. Near the back of the building, in a dimly lit alley where employees often went for fresh air, he spotted Jake and Emily. Their voices were low, but the quiet of the night made it easy to hear. Jake stood with his back against the wall, his arms crossed tightly over his chest. There was frustration in his posture, something restless in the way his fingers tapped against his arm. Emily leaned beside him, her expression calm but serious. "I don't know how you do it," Jake muttered, shaking his head. "How do you keep going like this?" Emily exhaled slowly. "What choice do I have?" Jake scoffed. "You could leave. You're one of the best people here. You could find another job." Emily offered a small, tired smile. "And then what? Let Tom run this place into the ground? Let the new hires fend for themselves? Someone has to hold this place together." Rick felt a pang of guilt. Emily wasn't a manager, yet she had taken on responsibilities that weren't hers. She was the one keeping morale up, the one helping younger employees survive in an environment that should have been supportive, but instead felt like a battlefield. Jake kicked at a loose pebble on the ground. I don't see the point anymore. No matter how hard I work, nothing changes. I'm stuck washing dishes while other guys my age are in school, actually doing something with their lives." Emily turned to look at him, her eyes softening. "You think what you're doing doesn't matter?" He shrugged. "Compared to what I want to do, yeah? Emily hesitated, then asked, "And what do you want to do?" There was a beat of silence before Jake finally admitted, "I want to be a chef." His voice was quiet, almost like he was afraid to say it out loud. "I know it sounds stupid, but I love cooking. I practice at home when I have time. But culinary school, that's a joke. There's no way I could afford it." Rick felt his heart tighten. This kid wasn't just another burned-out worker. He had dreams, aspirations. But the system he was trapped in made him believe those dreams were impossible. Emily, however, didn't look surprised. If anything, she looked proud. "That's not stupid, Jake. It's a real goal. And just because you can't do it now doesn't mean you never will." Jake let out a dry chuckle. "You sound like my mom." "Then she's a smart woman," Emily said. "Look, I know it's hard. I know this place feels like a dead end sometimes, but I refuse to believe that hard work doesn't pay off." Jake ran a hand through his hair. "Yeah, well, tell that to the guy who barely gets by on dishwasher wages." Emily sighed. "I know it's not fair, but you're good, Jake. You have talent. And one day you're going to get your shot. You just have to hold on until then." Rick swallowed hard. He had built this company thinking it would provide opportunities, that it would be a place where hard-working people could build careers. Instead, here was a kid who had already given up on his future because he believed no one at the top cared. And the worst part? Rick knew that if he had never come here himself, if he had just read a report or listened to a corporate briefing, he wouldn't have seen this. He wouldn't have known. He had been blind to the reality of his own business. Emily nudged Jake playfully. "Besides, I need you here. Who else would remind me to double-check Tom's math when he tries to short people on their paychecks?" Jake snorted. "You're still doing that?" "Of course," she said. "Someone has to." Rick stiffened. Short people on their paychecks? That was a serious accusation. Jake shook his head. "You have some nerve, you know that. One day Tom's gonna catch you." Emily shrugged. "Then let him. What's he going to do, fire me? He needs me more than I need him." Rick had seen enough. He turned and quietly made his way back inside, his mind racing. If Tom was manipulating payroll, that was beyond bad management. It was theft. And if Emily had noticed, it meant it had been happening for a while. He had come here expecting to find mismanagement. What he found was something far worse. Tom wasn't just a bad leader, he was corrupt. Rick needed proof. And once he had it, he was going to make sure Tom never set foot in one of his restaurants again. Rick returned to the kitchen, his mind still processing what he had just overheard. If Tom was stealing from his employees by manipulating payroll, that was not only unethical, it was illegal. But before confronting him, Rick needed proof. He couldn't just storm in and fire the man without solid evidence. He kept his head down, resuming his task at the sink as the restaurant prepared to close. The atmosphere had shifted slightly. Now that the rush was over, exhaustion settled into the bones of every worker. Conversations were quieter, movements slower. The staff worked as a unit to finish cleaning up, all of them eager to go home, though none of them seemed particularly hopeful about coming back tomorrow. Then, just as things seemed to be winding down, the kitchen door swung open with force. Tom entered, his expression hard, his gaze scanning the room for a target. It didn't take him long to find one. His eyes landed on a middle-aged cook named Rosa, a woman who had been working steadily all night, pushing through fatigue without complaint. "I left the walk-in refrigerator open earlier," Tom barked. Rosa straightened, confusion flickering across her face. I don't think I did," she said carefully. "I just checked the cameras," Tom lied smoothly. "You walked out and left. Play it wide open. That's a health violation. If we had inspectors in here, we'd be fined, and guess what? That fine would come out of your paycheck." Rick noticed the way Rosa's hands clenched into fists at her sides. "I always double-check. The door, Tom. Maybe someone else went in after me." "For you calling me a liar?" Tom challenged, stepping closer. Rick knew exactly what was happening. Tom was picking a scapegoat. He wanted to assert dominance, to make an example out of someone, and Rosa was unlucky enough to be in the wrong place. At the wrong time. The entire kitchen went silent, workers holding their breath, waiting to see how bad this would get. Rosa's voice was measured, careful. "I'm not saying that." I'm just saying I don't think I left it open. Tom smirked, clearly enjoying the power he had in this moment. Well, I don't care what you think. You've been making too many mistakes lately. Consider this your final warning. Rosa's lips pressed into a thin line. Rick could see the anger beneath her restrained expression, but what choice did she have? If she fought back, she could lose her job, and like so many others in this kitchen, she likely couldn't afford that risk. Rick had had enough. He dried his hands on a towel and stepped forward, careful to keep his tone neutral. Actually, he said, drawing Tom's attention, I was back there earlier and I don't think it was Rosa who left the fridge open. Tom's gaze snapped toward him, his expression darkening. Excuse me? Rick met his eyes evenly, refusing to shrink under the man's scrutiny. I was refilling ingredients from the walk-in a while ago, and I saw someone else go in after Rosa. Maybe they forgot to close it. He was lying. He hadn't been near the fridge, but it didn't matter. He needed to break Tom's rhythm, to plant enough doubt in his accusation that he would back off. For a long moment, Tom just stared at him. Then, he let out a sharp exhale, rolling his eyes. Whatever, he muttered. Just make sure it doesn't happen again. He turned his glare back to Rosa. From anyone. With that, he spun on his heel and stormed out of the kitchen, leaving behind a heavy silence. Rosa looked at Rick, surprised. He gave her a small nod before returning to the sink. He hadn't blown his cover, but he had made it clear he wasn't going to stand by and let Tom abuse his employees unchecked. A few minutes later, as the final cleanup continued, Emily approached him. That was risky, she said quietly. Rick shrugged. Didn't seem right. A small smile played at the corners of her lips. No, it wasn't, but most people here are too afraid to push back. She studied him for a moment. You sure you've never worked in a kitchen before? Rick forced a chuckle. Just a little experience. Emily tilted her head, clearly still curious about him, but she didn't push. Instead, she simply said, "Thanks," before returning to her tasks. As the night finally came to an end and the staff began heading home, Rick lingered for a moment, watching them go. Each of them carried their exhaustion differently, some with slumped shoulders, others with quiet sighs, a few with the determined stiffness of people who had no choice but to come back and do it all again tomorrow. Rick wasn't just going to fix this restaurant, he was going to change it. And Tom, his days were numbered. The next morning, Rick arrived early, blending once again into the ranks of the kitchen staff. He could have taken the day to rest, to analyze his next steps, but something about this place, about these people, kept him tethered to the moment. He wasn't just here to observe anymore. He was here to fix what had been broken. As he walked through the back entrance, the kitchen was already alive with activity. Pans sizzled, orders were being prepped, and workers moved with precision. But despite the well-practiced efficiency, the underlying tension remained. The presence of Tom loomed over them like a dark cloud, an ever-present weight on their shoulders. Rick kept his eyes open, watching for more signs of the manager's toxic influence. It didn't take long for the first incident of the day to unfold. Tom entered the kitchen just as one of the younger cooks, a man named Luis, was plating a dish. The meal was perfectly assembled, the colors vibrant, the presentation flawless. But the moment Tom reached him, he reached out and grabbed the plate, inspecting it with a critical eye. "This is wrong," Tom said, his voice dripping with condescension. Luis looked at the dish, then back at Tom. "What's wrong with it?" he asked cautiously. Tom set the plate down on the counter with unnecessary force. "You tell me." Luis hesitated, clearly searching for an answer. "Come on," Tom pressed. "If you can't see the problem, maybe you shouldn't be in the kitchen at all." Rick's grip on the dish towel tightened. This wasn't about correcting a mistake. Tom wasn't teaching, he was humiliating. Luis swallowed hard, his hands curling into fists at his sides. He looked down at the dish again, his breathing shallow. Finally, Tom scoffed. "Pathetic," he muttered. Then, without warning, he grabbed the plate and dumped its contents into the trash. "Do it again. And this time, try not to embarrass yourself." Luis didn't argue. He simply nodded, turned back to the grill, and started over. Rick clenched his jaw. He had been in kitchens long enough to know that mistakes happened. Correction was necessary. Discipline was important. But what Tom was doing, that was abuse. It only got worse as the day went on. A server hesitated while taking a complicated order, and Tom cut her off mid-sentence, snapping, "If you can't handle the basics, find another job." A busboy missed a spot while cleaning a table, and Tom sighed dramatically before wiping it himself, muttering just loud enough for everyone to hear, "This is what I have to deal with." When Rosa, the cook he had falsely accused the night before, asked for a short break after working non-stop for 6 hours, Tom gave her a cold stare. "You can rest when your shift is over," he said. "If you can't keep up, maybe you're not cut out for this anymore." Rick wanted to intervene. He wanted to grab Tom by the collar and throw him out of his own restaurant. But he forced himself to stay calm. If he wanted to make real change, he needed more than anger. He needed undeniable proof of Tom's incompetence and cruelty. Then, as if the universe had heard his thoughts, the opportunity presented itself. During the midday rush, Rick noticed a man in a crisp suit enter the restaurant. He had an air of authority, someone who clearly wasn't here for a casual meal. The staff seemed to recognize him too, their shoulders tensing at the sight of him. Rick watched as Tom straightened his posture, wiping his hands on his apron before approaching the man with a forced smile. "Mr. Harding," Tom greeted, his voice oozing fake politeness. "What a surprise, I wasn't expecting you today." Mr. Harding. Rick recognized the name. He was one of the regional supervisors, someone with direct ties to corporate. If there was ever a chance to expose Tom, this was it. "I had some business nearby and thought I'd drop in," Harding said, scanning the restaurant. "We've had some concerning feedback about this location. I wanted to see how things were running." Tom's smile didn't falter, but Rick saw the slight tension in his jaw. "Of course. Everything is completely under control. Just a few minor challenges, but nothing we can't handle." Harding raised an eyebrow. "Minor challenges? Nothing out of the ordinary," Tom assured him. "Some staffing issues, but I've been tightening things up. You know how it is. Sometimes you have to be tough to keep standards high." Rick's hands curled into fists. Tough? That was how Tom justified this. Harding nodded slowly, but his expression remained unreadable. "I'll be staying for a while to observe," he said. "Make sure the standards you're talking about are actually being met." Tom hesitated for a fraction of a second before nodding. "Of course, feel free to look around." Harding didn't wait for an invitation. He moved toward the kitchen, his sharp eyes taking in every detail. Rick knew this was his moment. For the next hour, he worked harder than ever, deliberately staying in Tom's line of sight. He made sure to be in the right place at the right time, witnessing every mistake Tom made, every time he snapped at an employee, every time he ignored a customer's complaint. Then the perfect opportunity arrived. A customer at table 9 sent back a dish, complaining that it wasn't what they had ordered. The waitress who had taken the order, a newer employee, apologized and rushed back to the kitchen, clearly nervous. Rick watched as she explained the situation to Tom, her voice hesitant. Tom didn't even look at her. "And," he said flatly. She blinked. I wanted to check how you'd like me to handle it." Tom sighed, rubbing his temples. "Do I have to do everything myself?" he muttered, loud enough for the kitchen staff to hear. Then, without another word, he grabbed the plate and stormed out of the kitchen, heading toward the dining area. Rick followed at a distance, making sure to stay within earshot. When Tom reached the table, his entire demeanor shifted. He put on a tight-lipped smile, his voice suddenly dripping with artificial charm. "I understand there was a problem with your meal," he said. The customer nodded. "Yes, I ordered the grilled salmon, but this is—" Tom cut her off with a chuckle. "I see what happened. You must have misread the menu." Rick stiffened. The woman frowned. "I don't think—" Tom raised a hand, stopping her. No problem, no problem. I'll have the kitchen fix it right away." Then, without another word, he turned on his heel and walked back toward the kitchen, muttering under his breath. Rick could barely believe what he had just witnessed. Tom hadn't just dismissed the customer's complaint, he had blamed her for it. And the worst part? Mr. Harding had seen the entire thing. Rick stole a glance at the corporate supervisor. Harding's expression was unreadable, but Rick could see the calculation behind his eyes. He had noticed. Good. Because this was just the beginning. Tom had built his authority through fear and manipulation, but that authority was crumbling, and soon Rick was going to bring it down completely. Rick had spent the last 2 days observing the toxic environment that Tom had cultivated. He had seen the fear in his employees' eyes, the exhaustion in their movements, the way they flinched when Tom was nearby. He had heard the frustration in Jake's voice, the quiet determination in Emily's, and the resignation in Rose's. He had watched as hard-working individuals were berated, overworked, and manipulated. And now he was done watching. With Mr. Harding present, Rick knew he had an opportunity to push Tom into revealing his worst instincts. The corporate supervisor had already witnessed some of the manager's behavior, but it wasn't enough. Harding needed undeniable proof that Tom was actively harming the business. Rick adjusted his apron and turned toward the kitchen staff, deliberately placing himself in the middle of the action. He needed to create a situation that would force Tom to expose himself even further. It didn't take long for things to escalate. As the evening rush picked up, tensions in the kitchen rose. Orders came in rapidly, the noise level increasing as cooks shouted over the din of sizzling pans and clattering dishes. The pressure was immense, but the team worked together, moving, like a well-oiled machine, until Tom interfered. The first sign of trouble came when a line cook, a man named Miguel, hesitated for just a second too long while plating a dish. Tom swooped in immediately, snatching the plate from the counter. "This is garbage," he snapped, dumping the food into the trash without even looking at Miguel. Miguel stiffened. "I just needed to—" "I don't want excuses," Tom cut in. "I want perfection." Rick stepped forward. "Looked fine to me." Tom turned sharply. "Did I ask for your opinion?" Rick met his glare evenly. "No, but I have eyes. That plate was fine. You didn't even check it before throwing it out." The entire kitchen went still. No one ever questioned Tom, at least not openly. Tom's eyes narrowed. "You don't seem to understand how things work around here, new guy." His voice was low, dangerous. Rick didn't back down. "I understand perfectly. I understand that you're wasting food and belittling employees instead of leading them. I understand that you create more problems than you solve." The tension in the room thickened. Harding, who had been standing near the pass, turned his head slightly, clearly paying attention. Tom scoffed. "I don't have time for this." He turned back to Miguel. "Redo the dish, and if you mess it up again, don't bother coming back tomorrow." Rick felt a sharp burst of anger, but he forced himself to stay composed. This wasn't the moment to reveal his identity. Not yet. He needed Tom to keep digging his own grave. And then, as if the universe was on Rick's side, a major issue presented itself. The printer that spat out online orders malfunctioned, causing a delay in processing takeout requests. A flood of tickets that should have been handled gradually instead piled up all at once, creating instant chaos. The line cooks scrambled to catch up, stress levels skyrocketing. Tom's response? He did nothing. Instead of stepping in to help or organizing a solution, he stood with his arms crossed, watching the kitchen descend into disorder. Rick saw his chance. "Do we have a system for prioritizing these orders?" he asked, keeping his tone neutral. Miguel, still shaken from his earlier encounter with Tom, nodded hesitantly. "Usually we just—" "It doesn't matter," Tom interrupted. "Just get them done." Rick's jaw tightened. "You want us to rush through all these orders at once? That's going to create more mistakes." Tom's face darkened. "Did I ask you to think? Just do your job." Rick exhaled slowly. "Fine." He turned to the other cooks. "Let's do this properly. First, let's separate the orders by timing so the earliest ones go out first. Then," Tom slammed his hand on the counter. "That's not your call." Rick didn't flinch. "No, but it's common sense." For a long moment, Tom just stared at him, his chest rising and falling with barely restrained fury. Around them, the kitchen staff hesitated, watching the confrontation unfold. And then, Tom made a fatal mistake. "You're fired," he snapped. "Get out." Silence fell over the kitchen. Rick tilted his head slightly, studying Tom. "You're firing me? You heard me." Rick nodded slowly. "All right." He reached up, untying his apron, but instead of handing it over, he folded it neatly, setting it on the counter. Then, he stepped back and straightened his posture. And for the first time, he let his full presence settle over the room. "You're making a big mistake, Tom," he said, his voice calm. Tom sneered. "Oh yeah? And why's that?" Rick exhaled, then turned his gaze toward Mr. Harding, who had been watching the entire exchange. "Because," Rick said smoothly, "I'm not just some temp worker." Recognition flickered in Harding's eyes. The corporate supervisor had likely suspected something was off about Rick's presence, but now, the truth was about to be laid bare. Tom, however, remained oblivious. He let out a sharp laugh. "Oh, then who the hell are you?" Rick took a slow step forward. "Richard Lawson," he said, "owner of this restaurant and your boss." The color drained from Tom's face. For a moment, no one spoke. The kitchen staff stared in shock, their exhaustion momentarily forgotten. Tom's mouth opened, then closed. He took a small step back, as if trying to physically distance himself from the weight of the revelation. Rick kept his gaze steady. "Now, let's talk about how this restaurant is really being run." Harding stepped forward, clearing his throat. "Mr. Lawson," he said, addressing Rick properly for the first time, "I think we should continue this conversation in private." Rick nodded, but he wasn't finished yet. He turned to the kitchen staff. "First of all, no one is fired," he said firmly. Then, looking directly at Miguel, he added, "And if anyone ever threatens to cut your hours over a single mistake again, you let me know personally." A few workers exchanged stunned glances. Emily, who had been watching from a distance, hid a knowing smile. Rick turned back to Tom. "Shall we?" he asked. Gesturing toward the office, Tom didn't move for a second, still in shock. Then, realizing he had no choice, he nodded stiffly and followed Rick and Harding out of the kitchen. The moment the office door shut behind them, Tom snapped back into motion. "Look, this is all a misunderstanding." Rick held up a hand. "Save. We're past that." Tom swallowed hard. Rick didn't let him finish. "I have seen everything I need to see," he said. "The way you talk to employees, the way you treat customers, the way you manipulate payroll. Yes, I know about that too." Tom's mouth opened again, but no words came out. Rick turned to Harding. "How many complaints have we had about this location?" Harding hesitated before replying. "Too many." Rick nodded, then looked back at Tom. "I should have been here sooner. That's on me. But now that I am, let me be clear. You're done." Tom's face twisted in desperation. "Wait, let's—" "Security will escort you out," Rick said simply. "Your employment is terminated effective immediately. And if I find any financial discrepancies in your records, expect legal action." The fight drained from Tom's posture. He had no more arguments, no more ways to manipulate the situation. Rick stepped back. "Get out of my restaurant." And with that, Tom was gone. The moment Tom was escorted out of the restaurant, the tension in the air shifted. It was as if an invisible weight had been lifted from the entire staff. But no one dared celebrate just yet. The kitchen remained eerily quiet, as if the workers were waiting for something to go wrong, for some cruel twist that would bring Tom storming back through the doors. But Rick knew better. Tom was gone for good. Rick turned to Mr. Harding, who was still standing nearby, arms crossed, as he observed the aftermath of what had just happened. "I'm going to take over management here for the next few days," Rick said firmly. "I need to make sure the damage he did isn't permanent." Harding gave a slow nod, his expression unreadable. "I had a feeling you weren't just here for a casual inspection," he said. Rick smirked slightly. "Let's just say I wanted the truth. And now that I have it, I need to fix it." Harding hesitated for a moment before speaking again. "I'll make the necessary arrangements for Tom's termination to be processed through corporate. You'll also need to appoint a new manager." Rick had already considered that. He wasn't about to bring in an outsider who would have to start from scratch, unfamiliar with the struggles of the team. No, this position needed someone who already understood what it meant to work in that restaurant, someone who had proven their leadership without ever needing the title. His eyes shifted toward Emily. She had watched the entire ordeal unfold from a safe distance, her expression unreadable. But now, as she realized Rick was looking directly at her, she straightened, her posture slightly, clearly unsure of what was coming next. "Emily," Rick called, "come with me for a moment." She hesitated, glancing around at her co-workers, then followed him as he stepped away from the kitchen. They stopped near the service station, away from prying ears, but still within sight of the staff. Rick turned to face her fully. "How long have you been working here?" he asked. Emily blinked at the sudden question. "Almost 7 years." "And in those 7 years, how many times have you had to step up and do a job that wasn't yours?" She hesitated, clearly choosing her words carefully. "A lot," she admitted, "but someone had to." Rick nodded. "That's exactly why I'm offering you the manager position." Emily's eyes widened slightly. You want me to run this place?" "Who else?" Rick said simply. "You've been doing it unofficially for years." She let out a small, breathless laugh, shaking her head in disbelief. "I don't know what to say." "Say yes," Rick replied. "Say you'll take the job and help me turn this place around. You know what needs to be fixed. You know what the staff needs. And most importantly, they trust you." Emily swallowed hard, her gaze flickering back toward the kitchen. The other employees were sneaking glances at them, clearly curious about what was happening. "You really think I can do this?" she asked quietly. "I know you can," Rick said without hesitation, "but it's up to you." Emily took a deep breath. Then, after a long pause, she nodded. "Okay, I'll do it." A small smile tugged at the corner of Rick's lips. "Good. First order of business, go tell your team they deserve to know who's in charge now." Emily nodded again, this time with more confidence. She turned and walked back toward the kitchen, and Rick watched as the realization spread among the staff. The tension, the uncertainty, they began to fade, replaced by something else, something he hadn't seen in this restaurant since the moment he stepped through its doors. Hope. But there was still more to do. Rick had come here expecting to find a failing restaurant. What he had found was a team that had been fighting to survive under the weight of poor leadership. Now that Tom was gone and Emily was stepping up, the next challenge would be repairing the damage that had been done. And Rick was ready for it. Rick stood at the edge of the kitchen, watching as Emily took in the weight of her new position. The team gathered around her, hesitant at first, as if afraid this was some kind of cruel trick. But when she finally spoke, clear, steady, filled with the kind of quiet authority that had always been there, he saw the moment they realized things were truly different. "I know things have been hard," Emily said, her voice carrying through the kitchen. "I know a lot of you probably thought nothing would ever change here. But starting today, we're doing things differently." The employees exchanged uncertain glances. "No more intimidation," she continued. "No more being treated like we're disposable. No more cutting corners because someone in charge only cares about numbers instead of people. We're going to do this right, together." There was a long pause before Rosa, the cook Tom had humiliated, spoke up. "And you're really in charge now?" Emily met her gaze and nodded. "Yeah, I am." Rosa studied her for a moment before nodding back. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Rick watched the exchange with satisfaction. He had made the right choice, but appointing a new manager was just the first step. If they were going to fix the deep-seated issues in this restaurant, they needed to make real, tangible changes. After giving Emily a moment to soak in her new role, Rick stepped forward. "All right, let's talk about what happens next." The staff turned to him, still adjusting to the fact that their undercover co-worker was actually the owner of the entire restaurant chain. "First things first," Rick said, "I want full transparency. If something's wrong, if there's something getting in the way of doing your jobs, I need to hear it. No more silence, no more dealing with problems on your own because you think no one at the top cares." A beat of hesitation. Then, slowly, voices started speaking up. "The supply orders are a mess," Miguel said. "We're always running out of ingredients we need, but we have too much of stuff we barely use." "I've been shorted on hours more than once," Rosa added, her voice edged with frustration. "And I know I'm not the only one." Jake, the young dishwasher, cleared his throat. The equipment's falling apart, the dish sprayer barely works, the walk-in fridge has issues with temperature, and half the knives in the kitchen are dull. Rick nodded, absorbing everything. Good. Keep it coming. One by one, the staff voiced their frustrations. Scheduling inconsistencies, unfair pay practices, equipment that hadn't been replaced in years. Things that Tom had ignored, things that over time had made an already demanding job nearly unbearable. Rick listened to all of it. Once they had said their piece, he spoke again. Here's what we're going to do. Emily and I will go over the schedules and payroll records to make sure everyone is being paid fairly for the hours they actually worked. No more of Tom's little adjustments. A few employees exchanged relieved glances. We'll also be making immediate repairs to the equipment, Rick continued. If something is broken, you tell Emily, and we'll get it fixed. No more working with faulty tools or broken machinery. Jake exhaled, tension visibly leaving his shoulders. And as for supplies, we'll review our inventory system and ordering process, Rick said. We should never be running out of essentials while overstocking useless items. We'll get it sorted. There was a long silence. Then Rosa spoke again. Are you really going to follow through on all of this? Rick met her gaze. Yes, and if I don't, I expect you to hold me accountable. Something flickered in Rosa's expression. Cautious hope. It was the same look Rick saw mirrored in the faces around him. They wanted to believe things would change. They just didn't know if they could. Rick understood. They had been let down too many times before. But he was going to prove that this time was different. The next few days were a whirlwind of change. Rick worked alongside Emily to implement every promise he had made. The first thing he did was bring in a payroll auditor. Within hours, they confirmed that Tom had, in fact, been manipulating employee wages, cutting hours, underpaying staff, and pocketing the difference. It was blatant theft, and Rick made sure corporate handled it accordingly. Every affected employee received immediate back pay for the money they had lost. The look on Rosa's face when she saw her corrected paycheck nearly undid Rick completely. She didn't cry, didn't thank him profusely. She just nodded, a quiet but undeniable weight lifting from her shoulders. That was enough. Next came the repairs. New knives were ordered, the dish sprayer was replaced, and a technician was called in to fix the temperature issues in the walk-in fridge. The supply ordering system was also overhauled. Instead of relying on whatever automated process corporate had set up, Rick made sure the people actually using the ingredients had a say in what was ordered. The results were immediate. No more shortages of essentials, no more waste from unnecessary items. But perhaps the biggest change wasn't logistical, it was cultural. Without Tom looming over them, the staff began to relax. Conversations became lighter, shifts less grueling. Employees who had once worked in tense silence now cracked jokes and supported each other freely. Mistakes were corrected with guidance, not humiliation. And as the restaurant began to thrive again, so did the people working in it. One evening, as Rick was reviewing some paperwork in the office, there was a knock at the door. Emily stepped. Inside, her expression unreadable. "You've been here almost a week now," she said. "Are you planning on staying forever?" Rick chuckled. "Tempting, but no, this is your restaurant now." Emily exhaled. "I don't know if I ever properly thanked you." "You don't have to," Rick said. "I should be thanking you. If I hadn't come here, I never would have realized how much I'd been missing." Emily studied him for a moment. "You really care about this place, don't you?" Rick nodded. "I built this company from the ground up. But somewhere along the way, I lost touch with what actually matters. Coming here, working in the kitchen, seeing what you all go through every day, it reminded me why I started this business in the first place." Emily smiled. "Well, in case you ever want to pick up a shift, I think we could find a spot for you in the kitchen." Rick laughed. "I'll keep that in mind." She hesitated, then added, "Jake told me you talked to him about his dream." Rick's smile softened. "Yeah, he wants to be a chef." Emily nodded. "He's good, really good, but he thinks it's impossible." Rick leaned back in his chair. Maybe it's time someone showed him otherwise. Emily's brows furrowed. "What do you mean?" Rick tapped his fingers on the desk. "Let's just say I have an idea, but I'll need your help." Emily tilted her head. "For what?" Rick smiled. for changing someone's life. Rick had spent his entire career believing that success was measured in numbers, profit margins, expansion rates, customer retention, statistics. He had built an empire by understanding the mechanics of business, by streamlining efficiency and maximizing results. But standing in that restaurant, surrounded by people whose lives had been shaped by the policies he had allowed to exist unchecked, he realized something. Numbers didn't build businesses, people did. And it was time to prove that he had learned that lesson. For the past few days, he had worked tirelessly alongside Emily to restore order to the restaurant. The atmosphere had changed dramatically. Staff members walked with their heads held higher. Customers lingered longer. And for the first time in years, there was a genuine sense of pride in the air. Employees who had once been afraid to speak up were now offering suggestions, pointing out improvements, and working together in a way that was no longer driven by fear, but by shared purpose. But there was still one thing left to do. Rick had spent time watching Jake, the young dishwasher who had all but given up on his dream. He had seen the way the boy's hands moved when he was chopping vegetables on break, the way he studied plates that left the kitchen, as if mentally deconstructing each dish. There was talent there, raw and unpolished, but real. And Rick knew that talent without opportunity was a tragedy waiting to happen. So on a quiet evening after the dinner rush had died down, he called everyone together. The entire staff gathered near the kitchen entrance, wiping their hands on aprons, exchanging curious glances. The past week had been full of changes, but this was different. There was something in the air, a quiet anticipation that none of them could quite place. Emily stood beside Rick, arms crossed, watching the employees settle in. Jake, still in his dishwashing uniform, looked around, confused. Rick cleared his throat. "I know it's been a long week," he began, his voice carrying through the space. "And I know things haven't been easy for a long time before that. But I want to take a moment to acknowledge all of you. The people in this room are the reason this restaurant is still standing. Not corporate, not some executive in a suit. You!" A murmur ran through the crowd. No one had ever told them that before. Rick continued. "There's been a lot of change, and I know change can be hard to trust, but I meant every promise I made, and now I want to talk about the future." He turned toward Jake, who blinked in surprise when he realized Rick was looking directly at him. "Jake," Rick said, "I've been watching you work." Jake stiffened. Okay?" Rick smirked. "Not in a creepy way. I've seen the way you look at food when it leaves the kitchen. I've seen how you handle ingredients even when no one's watching. And I heard what you said the other night to Emily about wanting to be a chef." Jake's face darkened slightly. "Yeah, well, wanting something doesn't mean it'll happen." Rick shook his head. "Not if you believe that, no, but I don't." A hush fell over the room. Rick reached into his pocket and pulled out a neatly folded piece of paper. He extended it toward Jake. The boy hesitated before slowly taking it. He unfolded it, his eyes scanning the contents. As he read, his hands began to tremble. His lips parted slightly, but no words came out. Emily, standing nearby, frowned. "What is it?" Jake's voice was barely above a whisper. "It's a scholarship." The room fell silent. Rick nodded. "Full tuition. One of the top culinary schools in the state, covered completely by me." Jake's head snapped up, disbelief written all over his face. This has to be a joke." Rick met his gaze, unwavering. "It's not." Jake shook his head, his breath coming uneven. "But why? Why would you do this for me?" Rick exhaled. "Because I see something in you, and because I can." He glanced at the rest of the staff. "Opportunities like this shouldn't be reserved for the people who already have advantages in life. Hard work should mean something, and sometimes people just need someone to believe in them." Jake swallowed hard. His fingers tightened around the paper as if afraid it would disappear. "I don't even know what to say," he whispered. Emily placed a hand on his shoulder. "You don't have to say anything," she said softly. "Just accept it." Jake's eyes flickered between them before he finally let out a shaky laugh, wiping at his face. I think I need to sit down." The room filled with quiet chuckles, and just like that, the tension broke. The staff, once skeptical, once beaten down by years of mistreatment, had just witnessed something they never expected. Proof that someone at the top actually cared. Rick felt something shift inside him. He had built a business, yes, but more importantly, he had just changed a life. And for the first time in years, he felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be. Jake sat down, still gripping the scholarship letter, as if it might vanish if he let go. The kitchen staff remained silent, processing what had just happened. No one moved, no one spoke. Then, Rosa, the cook who had spent years under Tom's mistreatment, broke the silence with a slow, deliberate clap. It wasn't sarcastic. It wasn't hesitant. It was real. One by one, the others joined in. A ripple of applause spread through the kitchen. Not the exaggerated kind of celebration, but something deeper, something rare in this place. Respect. Jake looked up, his face a mix of shock and gratitude. I don't deserve this, he muttered. Rick crouched down so they were eye level. You do, he said firmly. You just didn't think anyone would ever see it. Jake exhaled sharply, still overwhelmed. Emily gave his shoulder a reassuring squeeze before turning to Rick. You really mean to fix this place, don't you? Rick stood looking around at the team. Yes, and I'm not done yet. He turned to Rosa. Payroll has been corrected, but I want to make sure it never happens again. I need someone who understands how things work on the ground level to oversee scheduling and payroll approvals. Someone who knows when things aren't adding up. Rosa raised an eyebrow. You're offering me the job? Rick nodded. You know what's fair. You know what this staff has been through, and you're not afraid to speak up. That's exactly what I need. Rosa crossed her arms, clearly surprised. After years of being disregarded, having her opinions ignored, she was suddenly being offered authority. All right, she finally said. I'll do it, but only if I get final approval on overtime hours. Rick grinned. Deal. Miguel, who had been quiet through most of the exchange, finally spoke up. And what about customers? Rick tilted his head. What about them? Miguel hesitated. We spent so long getting blamed for everything. Bad service, long waits, wrong orders. But half the time, it wasn't our fault. Tom refused to let us speak up. If something goes wrong because of corporate policies, are we finally allowed to tell the truth? Rick considered the question carefully before answering. Yes, but we do it professionally. Customers deserve honesty, but they also deserve respect. If there's an issue that's out of your control, you tell them the truth and we fix it. No more taking the fall for bad policies. Miguel nodded, satisfied. A new energy settled over the team. There was still hesitation, still an underlying disbelief that things could really change, but for the first time there was also hope. Rick turned back to Emily. You're the manager now, you set the tone. What do you think this restaurant needs next? Emily exhaled, running a hand through her hair. We need training, real training, not just figure it out as you go or watch the person next to you. If we want to be better, we have to invest in learning. Rick smiled. Then we'll start training sessions. I'll make sure you have the resources. Emily smirked. Including you? Rick chuckled. I'll make an appearance. Jake, who had been quietly processing everything, finally found his voice again. What happens to Tom? Rick's expression darkened slightly. He won't be working in this industry again anytime soon. The truth was, Rick had already taken steps to ensure Tom's removal wasn't just from this restaurant. The financial discrepancies, the employee mistreatment, the falsified reports. Corporate was handling it. Tom wouldn't be getting another management position in any reputable company, but the damage he had done would take time to fix. Rick looked around at the people who had suffered under Tom's rule. This place is yours now, he told them. Let's make sure no one like him ever has power here again. And with that, real change began. The days following Tom's departure were unlike anything the staff had experienced before. There was no longer the constant weight of fear pressing down on them. No hushed conversations in the break room about who would be the next to lose their hours. No nervous glances cast toward the office every time someone made a minor mistake. Instead, there was something new, Something unfamiliar yet welcome. Relief. The first major test came on a Friday night, typically the busiest evening of the week. In the past, these shifts had been defined by stress, rushed orders, and the constant feeling that nothing they did would ever be good enough. But this time, with Emily leading the team, everything felt different. She moved through the restaurant with confidence, checking in with the cooks, reassuring the servers, and making small adjustments before problems could escalate. She didn't bark orders or criticize. She guided, and when mistakes happened, as they always did in a high-pressure environment, she corrected them without humiliation. Rick watched it all unfold from the sidelines, quietly impressed. The changes had already started making a difference. Customer reviews were improving, and for the first time in months, sales were climbing instead of declining. Employees who had once considered quitting were now staying late to help their co-workers, not because they feared punishment, but because they finally felt like they belonged to something worth fighting for. But there was still one person who had yet to find his place: Jake. Despite the scholarship Rick had given him, the young dishwasher still showed up for his shifts, still spent hours scrubbing pots and stacking plates as if nothing had changed. Rick found him in the back after the dinner rush, his sleeves rolled up, his hands raw from the hot water. "You know," Rick said, leaning against the counter, "most people would have quit the second they got a full-ride scholarship to culinary school." Jake glanced up, his expression unreadable. "I didn't want to leave without saying anything." Rick raised an eyebrow. "So you are leaving?" Jake exhaled, running a damp hand through his hair. "I don't know. It just doesn't feel real yet." Rick nodded, thinking. "What's stopping you?" Jake hesitated before answering. "What if I'm not good enough?" Rick let the words settle between them. He had seen this before. Talented people convincing themselves they weren't worthy of the opportunities given to them. "You ever heard of imposter syndrome?" Rick asked. Jake frowned. "Is that like food poisoning?" Rick chuckled. "Not quite. It's when someone feels like they don't deserve their success, even when they've worked hard for it, like they're just waiting for someone to call them a fraud." Jake was silent for a long time. Then finally he admitted, "Yeah, that sounds about right." Rick pushed off the counter and crossed his arms. "Let me ask you something. Why did you want to be a chef in the first place?" Jake shrugged. "I don't know. I love it. The way flavors work together, the way a dish can make someone's day better. It's the only thing I've ever really wanted to do." Rick nodded. "Then that's all the reason you need. You think I knew what I was doing when I started my first restaurant? I was winging it half the time. But I worked hard. I learned from my mistakes, and I didn't let the fear of failure stop me." Jake chewed on the inside of his cheek. "You really think I can do this?" "I wouldn't have given you that scholarship if I didn't," Rick said. "And trust me, I don't throw money around for no reason." Jake let out a small, breathless laugh. "So, what now?" Rick smirked. "Now, you start your new life." Jake exhaled, nodding slowly. "All right, I'll do it." The next morning, the entire staff gathered to see Jake off. Emily handed him a brand new set of chef's knives, Rosa clapped him on the back, and Miguel promised to visit his future restaurant one day. And as Jake walked out those doors, heading toward the future he never thought he'd have, Rick knew this wasn't just a business anymore, it was a family. Rick stood outside the restaurant, watching as Jake disappeared down the street. The young man walked with a hesitant but determined stride, gripping the chef's knives Emily had given him as if they were the most valuable possessions he owned. And in a way they were, not because of their material worth, but because of what they represented: a new beginning, a fresh start, a chance he had never thought possible. Rick exhaled, feeling the weight of the past week settle over him. He had arrived at this restaurant expecting to find a failing business, a location that had slipped through the cracks due to poor management. Instead, he had found something far more important: people who had been fighting every day to keep a broken system from collapsing completely. And now, for the first time in a long time, they weren't fighting alone. He turned back toward the restaurant, stepping inside as the staff slowly returned to their duties. The energy in the kitchen was different now, lighter, freer. Conversations that had once been whispered in fear were now spoken openly. Employees moved with purpose, no longer weighed down by anxiety or exhaustion. Emily, now officially the restaurant's manager, was at the center of it all. She gave instructions with confidence, checked on her team and ensured everything ran smoothly. She was still getting used to her new role, but it was clear to everyone that she had been born for this. Rick approached her near the service window, crossing his arms. "How's it feel to be the boss?" Emily smirked. "Exhausting." Rick chuckled. "Welcome to my world," she sighed, shaking her head. "Honestly, it feels right. Like this is where I was always supposed to end up." Rick nodded. "That's how you know you're in the right place." Emily studied him for a moment before asking, "And what about you? Are you sticking around?" Rick hesitated. He had spent years running his business from a distance, relying on numbers and reports to tell him what was happening in his restaurants. But being here, working side by side with the people who made it all possible, had reminded him of something he had forgotten. Success wasn't just about profit. It was about people. "I'll be back," Rick said. "I might have other restaurants to run, but this one's special." Emily smiled. "Good. Because if you think I'm dealing with corporate by myself, you're wrong." Rick laughed. "I'll take care of them. You take care of this place." She nodded, and for a brief moment, they stood there in comfortable silence watching as the restaurant hummed with new life. Then, just as Rick was about to head to his office, he overheard something that stopped him in his tracks. Two servers were talking near the break station, unaware that he was listening. "Did you ever think someone like him would actually care?" one of them asked. The others shook their head. "No, I figured we were just another paycheck to him like we were to Tom, but I guess we were wrong." Rick felt something tighten in his chest. He had always prided himself on being a good businessman, a smart investor, a leader who made decisions based on logic and strategy. But in all the years he had owned this company, he had never truly understood what it meant to be a part of it. Until now. He blinked, realizing his vision had blurred slightly. His throat felt tight. He had never been the type to get emotional over business matters, but this wasn't just business. This was people. This was change. This was what really mattered. He quickly wiped a hand over his face, clearing his throat before anyone could notice. Then, taking a deep breath, he straightened his posture and stepped forward. There was still work to be done. But for the first time in a long time, he knew exactly why he was doing it.